Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this final conference of the EP4U project. My name is Mariam, and I'm the Executive Director of TEPSA, the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, with members in 46 European countries. EP4U has been our project on citizen participation funded by the European Parliament. Over the last 18 months, we have been collaborating with people from across our pan-European network to reach young Europeans in the member states and to engage in discussions on topics that matter to them. Focusing on 4 policy areas, and these are climate, migration, fundamental rights, and employment, we have organized debates in several member states to discuss what young Europeans want for their European future. In France, Finland, Bulgaria, and Slovakia, EP4U has hosted high school talks, and university debates to gather ideas for the future of Europe from young Europeans on the ground. We have also run a student contest across Europe, the winners of which will present their visions for Europe today, together with 4 EP4U ambassadors who are academics in TEPSA's network and who have helped us achieve the project's goal over the last 18 months. Again, the panel sessions will deal with the main topics of the project: employment, migration, climate, and LGBTQI+ rights. But something else is happening in Europe today. Hundreds of people are dying in Ukraine every day as Ukraine tries to defend itself from an atrocious war by Russia. The way this war is evolving is also defining who we are as Europeans and what kind of a European Union we are living in. The future political development of the EU will depend to a significant extent on how it responds to the war on its doorstep, while Ukraine is defending its European choice and European values. We have therefore decided to focus the opening session of this conference on the implications of this war for the future of Europe. Our keynote speaker today is Benjamin Tallis, a fellow at Center for International Security at Hertie School in Berlin. He focuses on the international politics of European security and insecurity, particularly concerning borders, migration, the EU's foreign security and neighborhood policies, and their relations to the global order. We are very, very happy to have you, Ben, with us today as keynote speaker, and I will give you the floor now for about 15 minutes. You will have an opportunity to deliver your messages in this time frame, and then we would like to take a few questions from the audience. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Mariam, and to the TEPSA team who invited me to talk today. It's my pleasure to virtually be here and to have the chance to address this final session of what seems to have been a fascinating and very worthwhile project, and one that intersects with quite a number of themes of my research, particularly my work on uncancelling the future, which I'll get to a little bit later. As Mariam rightly said, there is quite a lot going on in Europe at the moment, and the responses of various European countries to the renewed and escalated Russian invasion of Ukraine tells us quite a lot about potential future directions for the EU. I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to relate it a little bit to the theme of youth, as that is appropriate for the audience and indeed the project. So, glasses on, it's serious now. What are the main reasons that we value youth? First, I would say for what it is, and second, for what it could become. So it's about both the present and the future. And in general terms, what does youth offer in the present? Well, it offers this youthful appearance, freshness, vigor, spirit, etc., the characteristics of someone who is young. And there's a certain connection to eros rather than thanatos, but I'll leave that for others to develop and to ponder on. But with this vigor and spirit, we also prize boldness, risk-taking, creativity, creation, the building of new things, the willingness to have a go, to experiment, and whether through confidence or perhaps ignorance, arrogance, or on the upside of things, curiosity, to try new things, to ask why things as they are, and ask why not change them, and how we might try and do things differently. So there's a certain boldness there, and there's a certain willingness to experiment and to change. But I think we also value youth for the potential future that it embodies, for what it may become. Its potential greatness is as yet unsullied by the tedious and tricky business of life, which is full of snares and snags and uncomfortable realities that wear us down. Obviously, that's not the full picture, but it's part of the picture, and that's what has yet to happen to youth. So there's an idea of potentiality there that is not yet eroded by experience. In politics, speaking in overgeneralizing in broad terms, we have 15 minutes after all, when we value youth, it's more perhaps in terms of people than in terms of institutions. In society, the youth in general, are often touted as the hope of the future, usually when there's a policy to sell without perhaps the substance behind it. So it's a bit like a company saying, our most important asset is our people. Yeah, no kidding. Right, but it's such an obvious thing to say, it's such an obvious truth that one starts to get a little suspicious. So the youth are often invoked in a way of talking about the future and about future investments, which might not actually have quite the substance behind it. So we have to be a little cautious and a little critical there, perhaps. But otherwise, while we do value experience and safe pair of hands, etc., this idea, we value youth in our politicians a bit like we do in our sports people, partly for that potentiality that they have, but also because of the dynamism, the vigor, and the so on that they bring to the table. The idea that a fresh approach can come, even if it turns out to be a perhaps quite conservative and often, or in some cases, even some would say corrupt approach, like the famous wunderkind of Austrian politics, Sebastian Kurz. Nevertheless, the packaging is there, the form, if not always the substance, but it does provide a contrast to the gerontocracy. I mean, think of the difference in appearance, at least, between Kurz and Joe Biden. In institutional terms, however, we tend to like the new, or at least the idea of the new, but not necessarily the young or the youthful. The drive to create something new, the new as an alternative to actually carrying through what we have and to realizing the potential of what we have, seems very appealing at times. But it's in permanent conflict with the forces of stasis and the forces of the status quo, saying nothing must ever change. And living in Germany, that's something I'm rather used to, the Muss sein Kultur, that everything is and must be because it is and must be. But when we talk about youth in institutional terms, we might refer to an institution in its infancy, or even a project in its infancy, a young democracy, or more unkindly, an immature democracy. And these are not compliments. They're the kind of descriptions that people in Central and Eastern Europe are sadly used to from the period after 1989. When famously, even by Timothy Garton Ash, there were people there were referred to as the children of 1989. This Pentecostal moment, as it seemed, this rebirth that happened, implies an idea of youthfulness or immaturity, which also requires an idea of parenthood coming from elsewhere. So there's a paternalistic aspect to some of these questions and issues as well. But with that youth did come hope. And it came with a feeling that, as the Czech IR scholar Michal Korjan put it recently, responding to a question I asked him, he said it came with the experience of pure, almost unlimited belief that things can go only better from 1989 onwards. And this was this youthful moment of the 1990s. And I just want to flag up briefly, because I'll come back to them later, that politicians such as the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, Slovak Prime Minister Eduard Heger, and the Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavsky all had a good part of their formative years during that time. Turning back to institutions, I think it's unfortunate that in some cases we don't value their youthful days more highly. And I'm talking particularly about the EU here. And again, this is very broad brushstrokes, so pick this apart in questions and read what I've written on it, because it's more developed in other places, and I'm happy to share links on that. The EU's forerunner organizations were created to find solutions to what seemed to be intractable problems from history. But the breaking point, the rupture of the Second World War, created this moment of newness, this moment that the old was gone and over the hill was coming the new, so try something different. And the need to try something different had been made clear to everybody. And you'll see where I'm going as an analogy there for the present moment. If not the scale is quite there yet, certainly the mental rupture I think we're experiencing now is an echo of that. And this was achieved through what I've called creative geopolitics. And to be fair, Roderick Parks of the German Council on Foreign Relations also calls it that. This reimagining of sovereignty and borders to foster mutual interference and oversight between different peoples, to allow the deeper engagement of people as well, and the frequency of their contacts and density of interaction. So you take the danger out of difference. And this power, what I call transformative power, and again, I'm not alone in calling it that transposed structural conflict into structural cooperation. And this transformative power not only transformed conflict, but also helped to transform what had been dictatorships into democracies, thinking of countries such as Germany, Greece, Spain, Portugal, as well as later on the Central and East European countries, who are normally the ones spoken about in that light. And they were included in this through this creative geopolitics and transformative power in a voluntary sphere of integration, which very much contrasts with the notion of a sphere of influence, as realist scholars like John Mearsheimer would talk about, or politicians such as Vladimir Putin, perhaps, not, of course, to equate the two. This was also based on a notion of what I call progressive security rather than protective security. And progressive security has at its heart the securing of a more hopeful future, the very basic idea that our children should live better than us, that the next generation could expect more than we do. And this idea was a fundamental animating concept of politics across the political spectrum for about 200 years in Europe, until somewhere about the late 1970s in Western Europe, perhaps, and a little bit later in Central and Eastern Europe, as we'll see. And this is, again, something I've written on. Of the philosopher Franco Berardi calls it the slow cancellation of the future. Rutger Bregman, in more popular terms, has written about this too, in his book Utopia for Realists, that we actually fear the notion of progress, and we fear the notion that we cannot deliver it anymore. And so we see a declining society. And that ushered in what Richard Youngs has called a protective security approach, to protect that which we have, rather than to try and progressively see the opportunities of the world and take them. We need to protect ourselves against the threats. The idea that we have a shrinking pie in future means that we circle the wagons around those we see like us, and we shut out increasingly those we see as different. So that's putting the danger back into difference. And it very much fits in with the agenda of Emmanuel Macron, the Europe that protects. It fits in with the policies during the migration, or the inward migration wave, that the EU turned into a crisis. It was not a crisis of its own making, but also things around the neighborhood policy, which is one of my areas of focus. And it increasingly became the way that the EU was treating Ukraine, as a source of threat to be kept outside, rather than a source of opportunity to be integrated, and as a mutual win-win for both people and states within the EU, and then in Ukraine as well. And what I've argued in a number of places is that this actually points to a self-fulfilling and a prophecy, in a way, from the EU to decline. It's based on a declinist idea. It's based on the idea that we cannot really change the world for the better anymore. We cannot transform threats around us into opportunities. Therefore, we have to protect against them. And we see this in, par excellence, the strategic compass, which projects the most gloomy, doom-laden, terrifying view of the world ever avowed by an EU institution, in order to do actually very little, if you look at the capabilities they're asking for. But the direction of travel is clear. I mean, they to really take a discursive sledgehammer to crack a very small capability nut. But at the same time, the idea of developing hard power capabilities, learning to speak the language of power, as Josep Borrell called it, and to create a quote-unquote geopolitical commission, are all part of this process of protective securitization and of trying to transform the character of the EU. It's a very long, ongoing process, I would say, since around 2004, 2005. This has really taken over as the defining ethos of the EU, while being in conflict with the better angels of its nature, let's say. But all that leads us to Ukraine, which has busted this open in a pretty spectacular fashion. And this, the crisis has not only shown that if we're looking at institutions in Europe to do defense, it's not the EU, it's NATO very clearly, that is trusted, but also saying what is then the EU's contribution. And the transformational shift in the rhetoric of Ursula von der Leyen, for example, saying Ukraine, they are us and they belong with us, we want them in. This was a really significant moment, I think. It upended about 20 years of EU rhetoric on Ukraine. Clearly, that's contested. We don't know what's going to happen later this month in terms of granting a candidacy perspective. But what we can also see is a shift in the way that EU governments have approached this, at least in some cases. And I'm particularly looking at those governments I mentioned before of Estonia, Slovakia, the Czech Republic. They're not alone in this, but they're the clearest examples, because what I would characterize their response to the crisis as being is one of a neo-idealism, a new idealism that prioritizes fundamental rights, it prioritizes fundamental freedoms, and it tries to reclaim the future of the 1990s in a way, this progressive, hopeful future that by the time they and I should say, I'm the same generation, came of age, this future had been somewhat stolen by 9/11, by the global war on terror, by the declining US hegemon, and the way that the sort of decaying neoliberal international order was going. So that future really never came to be. It was a lost future. And now I think that generation of leaders are really trying to see this back. So it's been widely commented that those countries are basing their response on their history in terms of Russia and Russian invasions of the past and so on. But I think there's another aspect of their history, and it's actually of those leaders' youth years that is being reclaimed. And it's also very youthful in terms of this idealistic bent to it, or idealistic underpinning to it, which prioritizes, again, this right to a hopeful future based on collective self-determination for democracies, rights to independence, the rights to the values for all states, not just great powers to assert their values and not to have to live in the sphere of influence of others. So I'm running a little bit out of time, and I do want to have the questions, but I hope there's some good provocative ideas there in order to say, I think this brings quite a lot of different things together. It brings together what we consider to be the value of youth. It brings together contestation of that as well, because of course, neo-idealism will meet the charge of being naive utopianism at some point. It's actually very interest-driven as well. And I think these leaders have really made the calculation that their interests are best served by tying others in to this community of values, and that actually as smaller states, the best they can do is to actually proclaim this values-based order as strongly as they can, because that serves their interests also. And that's very clearly what Zelensky has been doing as well. I would say this is to leverage the fairly meager material means that Ukraine had at its disposal by means of appealing to ideals. In address after address to parliament after parliament around the world, Zelensky has appealed to the better angels of those countries' nature, the better angels of their history, the more idealistic moments when they've really lived up to those things, and including in Germany, chastised them for when they have not. And so I think it's about sort of reclaiming this youthful optimism that is there, but not giving into the idea that it's just naive utopianism, about uncancelling the future, and about looking at how that might then relate to a shift in EU policy of the future. Because as I would see it, the EU's great geopolitical contribution was made through that creative geopolitics, transformative power, and progressive security. And the shift away from those to traditional geopolitics, hard power, and protective security has robbed it of its geopolitical influence and does nothing to actually uncancel its future. It leaves the future in the hands of those like Scholz or others who are really quite stuck in the past. And there was the very interesting last point this week, there was an article in Politico which said the EU's future lies in its east. And that's pretty much what I've been writing lately. It's not guaranteed, and by all means, let's not forget the contestation that goes on there. But there certainly seems to be a moment with some of these politicians saying, to use the words of the Stone Roses, a great band of the 1990s, the past was yours, but the future's mine. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, so much for this inspirational talk and also for highlighting the youth optimism. And there are many young people in the audience, and I'm sure they appreciate that. I have so many questions. I would have so many questions myself, including on the transformative power of the EU, whether most of the EU leaders currently actually still act with transformative intent or not. And how would you recommend the young people to engage in the issues that matter to them? But I think it would be fair that I leave the floor to others. You can raise your hand with a raise hand function so that we actually see you, and then we'll give you the floor to ask your questions to Benjamin. Thank you so much. Are there any hands raised? I don't see any yet.
So much for youthful enthusiasm, eh?
Well, well, maybe then, Ben, maybe you could respond to those two questions that I
Sure. So do most EU leaders actually still believe in transformative power was the first question, or do they act in that way? Yes and no. I think Richard Youngs would give you a more balanced answer than I would, and his book from last year, The EU and Global Politics, is a wonderful description of this, to the extent to which the EU does and the extent to which it doesn't, and which countries do and which countries don't across a range of policy areas. My feeling is a little less nuanced than that, is that no, I think they've largely given up on it. And I think this crisis of confidence comes with that failure to face the future, failure of self-belief somehow, which is why an injection of youthful idealism, youthful optimism is exactly what is needed. The willingness to look around the world and say, hey, it's tough. Of course it's tough, but we can do this. We've got this. I mean, think about the world of 1945, the world of 1949, and the world of 1989. They were hardly certain times. And in the case of 45 and 49, and even 57, if we look at it, they were not safe worlds then. They were not happy worlds in many ways. We saw the superpower face-off, the possibility of nuclear Armageddon was coming in there. Yet we managed to grasp that and say, how do we transform that into a path of mutual benefit? How do we take the moment of 89, uncertainty, and carve this path of mutual benefit from it? That takes boldness. It takes what Jacques Delors actually would have called vision and heart, but also strategic realism about what is our contribution and how we can make it. And simply giving up to the blows of fate, and trying to batten down the hatches as best you can, is something that both Richard and I would agree on is not an approach that's going to fly at all. I see we have a question, so I'll move to that, and then we can come back to what people can do later.
Vitko Marelitz raised hand, and then we also have a comment from Jim Close. Maybe we give the floor to Vitko, and then I'll read the comment from Jim. Yes, the floor is yours.
What's the EU's greatest failure in the 21st century?
Well, we have only a short time, so I don't have time to go into all the possible runners and riders. But in terms of greatest, I think it is that the failure to seize the moment in 2004 and to push on and make the European neighborhood policy a vehicle for further enlargement. I think this is when the EU stops swimming and starts dying, to use if we see the EU as a tuna. Which not many do, but this to me was the moment when, at the very peak of its success and the very confirmation of its geopolitical model, it starts to get nervous, it starts to get hesitant, starts to see the neighborhood as a testing ground for its ambitions as a direct security actor, as an overt security actor, rather than a deep security provider. And that, I think, it's part of a complex range of different changes that go across different policy spheres. But I think it's that underlying shift in mindset, which also relates to the comment in the chat that I'll address in a second, about what the EU needs to do to have relevance. And it starts to lose its way, basically, and lose its unique identity for not very good reason, in my opinion. So I would say that's the greatest failure. But it would be interesting to hear others' opinions on that too.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks for the question. Our Secretary General, Jim Close, wrote a written comment. He says, excellent presentation, but I think the opposition between protective and progressive security is too stark. I think we need both enthusiasm and idealism and more hard power and a dose of realpolitik. Maybe you could reflect on that, Ben.
Yes, the caricature description that I presented is indeed possibly slightly stark, but let me say very clearly, without the means to defend itself, including military capabilities and hard power, no liberal order can survive. But without a defensible moral core or the hope of progress, it cannot thrive. And I think what we're lucky enough to have in Europe, which we haven't realized the potential of, is two different organizations that can do those different things in a highly complementary manner, as they did in the past, but with a division of labor that needs to be significantly revived. So I would leave the hard power side of things very much to NATO. As far as the EU is involved in that, I think it should be involved in defense industry coordination and in the better production and procurement and deployment of capabilities. I don't think, I'm honestly of the opinion we should drop the D from CSDP, largely speaking. It's not going to happen anytime soon. There's too many politicians and other interests vested in that. But let me address the question of realpolitik. I don't think there's much that's actually real about realpolitik. I think the greatest trick that realism ever pulled was to claim to be an accurate representation of the world, a positivist vision of how things are, whereas it's actually quite a prescriptive description of how things should be. And John Mearsheimer is only one example, but he's probably the best to use in this regard. The constant shifting between is and should be is so apparent in his work. And what that does is condemn smaller states in particular to irrelevance. They become pawns in other people's chess games. So in terms of accurately assessing threats, I completely agree with you. And I think so that the general popular usage of the term realism, absolutely, we need to be realistic. That's right. If we're going to be realist or engage in realpolitik, then I'm less certain that's actually the way for the EU to go. Others do that much better. And if the EU goes down that road, we risk becoming a fairly common garden, mid-size aspirant power just without the capabilities, coherence, or credibility to really deliver on it.
Thank you. Ben, you mentioned NATO, and I think you implied that NATO should remain a linchpin of European security. Do you think that we will see an emergence of a stronger European pillar of NATO as a consequence of Russia's war in Ukraine?
I sincerely hope so, and I think there's a good chance that we will. It depends on a couple of things. It depends on especially France and Germany getting their act together in this regard. The French commitment to the TFP in Romania was very encouraging, and that the tailored forward presence in Romania was very encouraging in that way. The Zeitenwende in Germany isn't dead because it hasn't happened. So I think an actual Zeitenwende is needed to really put Germany at the heart of a European pillar of NATO, which I think is needed for a European pillar of NATO to be effective and strong, and for Germany to field the kind of large, capable ground force that should actually underpin deterrence by denial, as well as reassurance to allies more widely. It also needs the UK, and the UK needs to decide a little bit whether it wishes to be global Britain in the sense of contributing meaningfully to a global order that it believes in, i.e. by contributing to security in Europe, or whether it has ambitions to be an Indo-Pacific power, which is of questionable value in my view. But if you want to read a counterpoint of view, the Council on Geostrategy in London have very good work on that makes a good case for the opposite. I think the other part is looking at Central and Eastern Europe. And as I've mentioned, the response in Central Eastern Europe has been different to the response elsewhere to Ukraine. And certainly the investment we're seeing in defense in Poland is huge. That will play a big part in European NATO. The invitations of the Baltic states to host more troops from other countries as part of deterrence by denial rather than tripwire deterrence is a potential big change. And it's also in this that we can see a tension with neo-idealism, because there's no way anyone's describing the Polish government as fully neo-idealist or fully liberal at the moment. And the Polish society is at a crossroads in that regards, I think, because there's a conflict between the very conservative, almost reactionary values of the PIS government, and then Poland's dependence on actors like the US and other EU members as well, to which it needs to appeal to on a more values basis. And that's where I think the role of, for example, Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala is quite interesting, because as a conservative, talking to people like Morawiecki in Poland, I think he's playing a role in dragging them a little bit further away from the extreme reactionary end and more towards the mainstream there. But the contest is on, and it's on in most of our societies for either a more neo-idealistic approach or a more realpolitik and quite reactionary at times domestic policy.
Thank you, Ben. We have a hand raised, so I think I can take this last question. We can take this last question, and it's from Catherine Fitch.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I actually am studying European youth policy right now, so this is an excellent part of my research. What do you think the role is of politically active youth in energizing or returning to the norm of neo-idealism in Europe and the EU? And then what is the role of the EU in combating paternalism that is especially felt in Eastern Europe in countries like Ukraine and Romania, Poland, where the youth just don't care?
Okay, let me take the second question first. The first thing that the EU and some of its larger member states need to do is get a little bit more reflexive about their own shortcomings and to address I mean, it's easy to recommend, let's see if it happens. But a lot of the analyses you read about the attitude towards Central and Eastern Europe locate a lot of the EU's problems in Central and Eastern Europe and are very blind to the myriad shortcomings of democracies in Western Europe. The Dutch government resigns because of an institutionalized fraud and racism scandal, only to be re-elected months later in a slightly changed constellation. Imagine if that had happened in Poland, how that would have been reported. Look at the repeated scandals in Austria. Belgium, governmentless for years, and with a very, very strong right-wing, consistent ethno-nativist presence. Denmark's attitude to migrants, Germany's challenge to the European Constitutional Court, not to mention Legion other failings related to Russia, the Gaullist France First vision of the EU, not just French policy, but the EU across the shared between Macron, Le Pen, Mélenchon, and others. I mean, remarkable, really, to see how these shortcomings are never really discussed. And we all know that the problems of the EU relate to, on one side, a little bit of institutional reform, and on the other side, Central Eastern Europe. So the need to reflect, I think, is absolutely crucial there. And the need to listen and to take seriously the actual equal membership that Central and Eastern European countries have in the European Union. They haven't helped themselves, many of them, in the last 10 years, let's be frank. The Czech government from 2014, end of 2013, the PIS government, the Fico government in Slovakia, just as three examples, were not there making a great case to be listened to. Now, I think it's very different, certainly in Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states have been making an excellent case to be listened to, but they need partners to do that who are willing to listen and not just overlook them. And that's actually, I think, where citizens can put pressure on their governments to do that. Because looking actually at what is going on, the citizen views across Europe on Ukraine, on including Ukraine, for example, on granting candidacy status, but also on taking the concerns of Central and Eastern Europe more seriously. Certainly in Germany, a case I know well, people are enraged at the failure to have done that. And they want change in that regard. And so basic democratic action, like calling your MP, like writing to your MP and telling them that, giving them the ammunition to work with, actually, when they can then take to social media, they can go through their committees. This kind of stuff can actually work. It's a long lever, I know. The other side is actually getting creative and going out there and making elements of the future. And that's across all, that's not just politics, but that's about culture, that's about civil society initiatives and so on. And it's having the hope to actually believe and go and do that. Without that hope of creation, there is no future to work with either. And so I think that's what I would encourage in very broad brush terms people to do. Why is it, for example, that Kraftwerk still sounds like the music of the future? It's 50 years old. We need a new future music.
Thank you, Ben, so much for this positive note, a very clear message. And I think your speech really provided an excellent framework and a basis for further discussions within this conference. I will now give the floor to Tom Chevalier, who will be moderating the next panel, which is about non-discrimination policies in the Western Balkans. And wholeheartedly would like to thank you again for being with us today.